Welcome to This Explainer. You know, everyone is talking about AI right now. We're constantly hearing about GPUs, advanced silicon, and massive data centers. But today, we're going to dive into a pretty surprising paradox. It turns out the world's most advanced artificial intelligence infrastructure actually depends entirely on the second lightest, most invisible element on Earth. When most of us hear the word helium, we instantly picture party balloons or blimps, right? But the reality of this gas in extreme tech environments is much more intense. It's literally an invisible, irreplaceable bottleneck. Now, you might have seen some recent headlines about China temporarily halting its helium exports, which sparked a lot of fear across the tech world. But to understand what's really happening here, we need to take a much closer, data-driven look beyond those headlines. So here is our roadmap for today. 1. The invisible AI ingredient. 2. A fragile global supply. 3. The geopolitical supply fracture. 4. China's defensive export ban. 5. Impact on global tech. And 6. The hidden supply chain.
Section 1. The invisible AI ingredient.
To really get this, we have to zoom in on extreme ultraviolet or EUV lithography. This is the cutting-edge process used to print circuits on advanced AI chips. High-power carbon dioxide lasers strike microscopic tin droplets to generate a highly precise 13.5 nanometer wavelength plasma. The environment inside these machines is just incredibly extreme. Because of helium's unique chemical inertness, its high thermal conductivity, and its transparency to EUV radiation, it acts as the absolute perfect backside cooling agent for silicon wafers. Without helium, those wafers would literally destroy themselves from the heat.
And it's not just thermal management. Helium is an absolute necessity for high-precision tech across the board. Because its molecules are so incredibly small, it acts as an essential tracer gas to verify vacuum structural integrity, finding microscopic leaks down to 10 to the negative 10 millibars per liter per second. It controls plasma density during the etching process. And stepping outside of chip manufacturing, liquid helium is highly critical for chilling the superconducting magnets used in MRI scanners and advanced scientific research.
Industry leaders have actually known about this vulnerability for a while. Back in June 2026, the former CEO of Cadence explicitly warned that helium constraints pose a significant, underappreciated physical bottleneck to semiconductor fabrication and the broader AI boom. And well, that perfectly sets the stage for the global shortage we've been seeing. Section 2. A fragile global supply. Historically, global helium production has suffered from extreme geopolitical concentration. The United States and Qatar have really dominated the output. And here's an interesting fact. Despite being at the center of the recent news regarding an export ban, China historically produces less than 2% of the global supply. When we dive into the identified resource volumes tracked by the U.S. Geological Survey, the picture gets even clearer. You see, helium isn't just something you can easily mine anywhere. It's extracted almost exclusively as a byproduct of natural gas processing. And economically viable helium is heavily concentrated far outside of East Asia, residing primarily in Qatar, Algeria, and Russia. 85%. That is a massive metric to keep in mind. Because of a fundamentally weak domestic resource base, China actually imports roughly 85% of its helium requirements. They are deeply, deeply dependent on overseas supply for their own domestic high-tech manufacturing and AI ambitions. Section 3. The geopolitical supply fracture. So the 2026 shortage didn't just happen overnight. It was triggered by a distinct chronological cascade of crises long before China took any action at all. It starts back in June 2024 when the U.S. fully privatized the Federal Helium Reserve, effectively stripping away a major strategic government buffer. Then, in March 2026, massive physical disruptions hit the Middle East. Just a month later, strict export controls came out of Russia. Only after all of that, in July 2026, do we see China's export ban. Let's look a little closer at that March 2026 event. The Ras Laffan disruption was a massive shock to the system. Amidst regional conflict, strikes physically damaged the Pearl GTL facility and LNG infrastructure in Qatar, forcing Qatar Energy to declare force majeure. It's really important to separate Qatar's total market share from the actual volume lost here. The physical damage removed about 5.2 million cubic meters per month. That meant roughly 5 to 14% of the entire global supply basically vanished overnight, initiating some very severe market tightening. And compounding that physical facility damage was an absolute logistics nightmare. Liquid helium has to be transported in highly specialized cryogenic containers, and it continuously boils off. You generally have a strict 35 to 48-day window before the gas is totally lost. With maritime routes in the Middle East severely restricted, vessels had to reroute all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. That detour added so much substantial transit time that precious liquid helium was literally boiling off and vanishing into the atmosphere during the extended journey.
Section 4. China's defensive export ban.
Now, we need to be very careful here to strictly separate official facts from market analysis. On July 10, 2026, China's Ministry of Commerce and the General Administration of Customs enacted a temporary export ban on helium. There were 0 exemptions and absolutely 0 stated rationale in the official document. However, market experts assess this ban as a downstream reaction, essentially a purely defensive move to prioritize uninterrupted supply for their own domestic high-tech manufacturing in the face of a massive global shortage.
Put simply, China did not create the global helium shortage. Historically, Chinese industrial gas distributors basically acted as global intermediaries, importing foreign gas and then re-exporting volumes overseas. By placing a temporary export restriction on Customs Code 28042900010, the government effectively trapped whatever supply these distributors could secure inside their own borders, purely to preserve domestic availability.
Section 5. Impact on global tech. The financial impact of all this was incredibly violent and immediate. By the second quarter of 2026, the price of imported tube trailer helium in China had surged by an astonishing 180% year-on-year. At the exact same time, major Japanese industrial gas distributors announced sweeping 30% price hikes across their entire helium product portfolios, explicitly citing these global supply constraints. But honestly, despite these massive price shocks, we are seeing adaptation rather than a total collapse of the industry. Look at how the major players reacted. South Korean memory chip makers like SK Hynix had really high exposure to Qatari helium, but they proactively maintained inventory buffers to tide them over for months. Meanwhile, Taiwan's TSMC, a true leader in logic chips, had already diversified their sourcing and aggressively accelerated their advanced coolant and process gas recycling technologies. And the power of that adaptation is just staggering. Some analyst reports suggest that TSMC has actually achieved on-site helium recovery rates of up to 80 to 90% in their leading facilities. Think about that. By capturing and reusing the gas, they are fundamentally altering their reliance on new liquid procurement from a highly volatile global market.
Section 6. The hidden supply chain.
I think the overarching takeaway from this explainer is that supply chain diversification is no longer optional. It's absolutely mandatory. Semiconductor fabs worldwide are going to be forced to treat sophisticated gas recycling systems as a fundamental operational requirement to insulate themselves from geopolitical trade barriers. It's no longer just a nice-to-have ESG initiative. We have to recognize that invisible industrial gases are now critical geopolitical assets, especially since spinning up brand new extraction projects literally takes years.
Because ultimately, the future of artificial intelligence depends on a vast network of hidden dependencies. GPUs and data centers, well, they're really only part of the story. Understanding these invisible materials is just as important as understanding the chips themselves. So I'll leave you with this to think about. As AI infrastructure continues to expand aggressively across the globe, what other invisible industrial materials will become our next strategic bottlenecks? Thanks so much for exploring this with me today, and keep looking beneath the surface.